Everyone. I'm Anita Slate, and I'm a library assistant here at River Falls Public Library. And tonight I'm thrilled to introduce Jerry Apps, a celebrated rural historian, a professor emeritus at UW-Madison, a longtime 4-H leader, a county extension agent, a fair judge, a lifelong fairgoer, a blogger, a Facebooker, and an author of 35 books. Also, Jerry's publicist, Chris, is hanging out in the green room, and he kindly sent us a copy of Jerry's newest book to raffle off. So write a comment or ask a question on the side if you're watching, and stay until the end to hear Jerry's answers and find out if you won. So welcome back, Jerry. It's been a long time since we've talked with you.
Yeah.
And we have 40 minutes to go through 178 years of Wisconsin state and county fair history. So we should probably get started. So anyway, welcome, Jerry. We're glad to have you.
Well, I'm more than pleased to be here. And the topic is one that is near and dear to my heart, county and state fairs. As a 4-H member, going back to, can you believe it, 1946, I started showing cattle at the Waushara County Fair. And let's put up the cover of the picture of the book so people can have a chance to look at it. Meet Me on the Midway is the title of the book that I'm discussing tonight. But this early background, and let's go to the next slide, please, goes back to my dad, a longtime farmer. He started showing cattle in the 1920s. Can you believe that? And he was caught up in the idea of the county fair. I think both as a social activity for him, a recreational activity, and as a way, which was true of a lot of farmers in those days, the fair was a way for a farmer to learn from other farmers and to have a standard against which they can do their work. And so if you're showing cattle and your particular animal came in first place, you knew you were doing pretty well. But if it came in fourth place, well, you knew you had to make some improvements. So these are some of the ribbons that my dad received way back in the 1920s. Next, please. This is yours truly with his 4-H calf in 1947. This little calf and I had an interesting relationship. It's a little bull calf. He had a mind of his own, and I was bound determined that I was going to teach him how to lead, and eventually that happened. And we went together to the Waushara County Fair, and I did get a first place ribbon. I've never forgotten the thrill of experiencing a blue ribbon with an animal that I had worked hard with all summer. And there were moments when I thought I would never make it, that the calf would win and I would lose. But my dad said, you gotta be persistent, you gotta keep at it, and how right he was. Next, please. As we look at the history of fairs, and one of the things I do with all of my books, all of my history-related books, is to dig as deeply as I can into the history of that particular topic, and in this case, fairs. And I discovered something very interesting. I discovered that fairs go way back to 500 BC in Southern Europe. 500 BC, there were fairs, and they were mostly religious and market affairs. Nothing like we think of a fair today. No Midway, no Ferris wheel, none of those things. And no judging, nothing like we have now. But they were called fairs, and they were fairs, and they persisted. Well, they persisted to this day, obviously. But the Romans took the idea of a fair to Northern Europe, and then many of the immigrants to this country obviously had come from Northern Europe, and they brought with them the idea of a fair. Let's go to the next slide, please. First fairs, 500 BC, religious and market affairs. 200 BC was when the Romans took fairs to Northern Europe. Next slide, please. Now, what happened in this country? In 1807, that's when we believe the very first fair was held in the United States, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 1807. And in 1842, 6 years before we became a state, the first fair in Wisconsin opened in Waukesha. And I have here, I dug out what that first fair was like. And there were prizes to the best yoke of oxen. For the best horses, 4 horses were entered. There were a few sheep and a few hogs, and there was a plowing contest. And that was essentially what that first fair in Wisconsin was all about. Next, please. Well, what makes a fair a fair? And that's an interesting question. And I begin to probe an answer. And I start with the idea of exhibits. Exhibits are an essential part of a fair. And what we're looking at here is the garden department at the Waushara County Fair, where there are some first place carrots and some skinny, miserable looking carrots. Geez, I was a garden judge at one time. They were in, they didn't make it into the blue ribbon category. They were in second place. Next slide, please. The exhibits were varied all over the place. Here we are in Langlade County way back in the 1930s, I would guess. And they're showing their cattle. They're outside and a few people are watching. But dairy calves, the dairy project in a state like Wisconsin, we might guess that dairy calves were an important part of the county fairs, and that continues to be so to this day. Next slide, please. And of course, fairs began with exhibits only from men. And then women were added, and quilt making and cooking and sewing and all that sort of thing were a part of the exhibits at the fairs. It took a while before fairs allowed young people to show. And when 4-H got going, officially in 1914 with the Smith-Lever Act, I think that's correct, then young people began showing at the fair along with FFA. And then the youth part of the fair almost took over. And in many fairs, it was, well, I shouldn't say many, several fairs were just junior fairs, meaning they were solely for young people. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is the Lodi Fair, and here we see sheep. That was a popular. There are lots of sheep in the fairs. The next slide, please. The next part of what makes a fair is judging. And I was a fair judge for, 10, 12, 14 years, something like that. And the fair judge's responsibility is to look at the exhibits in a particular class, meaning a particular category, and determine which ones merited a blue ribbon or first place, and which ones should be in second and third and fourth and fifth place. Those are the usual placings at a judged event at a fair. And the judging was very important because it was the judging that, as I pointed out earlier, that provided the exhibitor as well as the fair visitor to see what quality meant, to see what excellence was all about. And the judging helped make that so. So here we see judges working at the Waushara County Fair in the garden project. Let's go to the next slide, please. I also, at one time, was a livestock judge, interestingly enough. I was a livestock extension agent in Brown County at one time. And here we see at the Rock County Fair, a young man with his prize-winning steer. And let's go to the next slide, please. This was a very common sight the judging of dairy cattle. Anybody who's been in 4-H, anybody who's had the dairy project in 4-H would resonate with this picture, because they will remember how you walked around the ring with the judge standing in the center with a glum look on his face, a serious look. And as my dad said, from his experience with judges, he said, keep your eye on your calf and your other eye on the judge. And I don't know how you're supposed to do that and not tipping yourself over walking around, but that's what I tried to do. You watch the judge, you watch your calf, and if the judge happened to nod at you, oh, that's what you wanted, because that meant he was, particularly in the early walk around, he was pulling out the best animals first. And you knew when the judge nodded at you that your calf was likely destined to receive first place. Next slide, please. Of course, the clothing exhibit, as women became involved in the fair, that became more and more important. And it was a way, again, for women to compete with each other and be able to pick out, why was this dress better than that dress? And my wife was a clothing judge at one time, and she was involved with doing that sort of thing. If we could go to the next slide, please. Here we see a gentleman whose name is Clarence Olson. He's passed now. He happens to be my brother-in-law. He judged fairs for 50 years. He loved it. He was a cattle judge. He was a dairy specialist working for University of Wisconsin Extension. He loved fairs. He went to fairs all over the state, judging cattle. He loved young people and working with them. And you can see the smile on his face. Here he's at Langlade County with a young woman who has just received a blue ribbon for her dairy animal. Next slide, please. What else makes a fair a fair? Well, it's the Midway. The Midway often is the attraction that brings people to the fair. And this is a photo at the Oneida County Fair, but the Midway wasn't always a part of fairs. The early fairs that I talked about did not have a Midway. We did not see Midways at fairs, whether they be county fair, state fair, regional fair, until 1893, when the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, was held in Chicago. And at that fair, they had a section set aside for what became known as the Midway. And one of the things that they did at that first fair, or that first Midway at the World's Fair, was to have rides. And the rides, let's go to the next slide, please. The next, one of the most important and iconic rides at a fair is the Ferris wheel. There were no Ferris wheels before 1893. And a fellow by the name of George Ferris was asked by the people responsible for organizing the World's Fair in Chicago to come up with something that would be so spectacular that it could compete with the Eiffel Tower in France. And he came up with the Ferris wheel. And the Ferris wheel has been a part of fairs forever after. If there's one thing that you look for when you go to a fair, is the Ferris wheel. And we sort of take it for granted, not knowing that its history goes back to 1893. Next slide, please. And then there's the merry-go-round. Who doesn't remember the merry-go-round? As a kid, I thought it was wonderful to hear that beautiful music and to see these little phony horses going around and jumping up and down and having a chance to ride on them. What fun it was. And have you ever seen a youngster riding on those horses who didn't have a big smile on his face? Well, maybe some of them were maybe a little scared, but it was a wonderful addition to fairs. Next slide, please. And then there were the races and the contests at the state fair. And here we see a family at the state fair, and there's a bunch of bottles, and I think you throw some kind of a ring and you win a teddy bear or something like that. And those became very popular. One of the most popular, I don't have a picture of it, is the one where the person guesses your weight and guesses your age. And anyway, all of that stuff draws people to the fair. And one way of thinking about it is, if you can get them to the fair, they can see something, they will learn something deeper about agriculture and rural life, and they will learn it without realizing they are learning it. As they see the animals, as they see the judging, as they see the various kinds of exhibits. I'll come back to that point in a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. Horse racing. Oh my gosh. Horses, once they replaced oxen, became very popular at fairs. And the idea of a horse race continues to this day. Several fairs have horse racing, in this case, sulky racing, as a part of the attraction at the fair. And then next slide, we also saw horse pulling contests. My team can outpull your team. Can't you just hear a couple of old farmers saying that to each other? And this way, with the horse pulling contest, they could prove it, whether or not their team was better at pulling than the neighbor's team. Next slide, please. And then when cars came along, there were car races. Oh my gosh. Demolition derbies, all that sort of thing. Those are still major attractions at fairs. Next slide, please. This one is no longer popular, nor I think even allowed. You can barely read that, but it's baby Thelma, who weighs 600 and some pounds and is some kind of a feminine beauty. My gosh, that today that wouldn't make it and shouldn't. But the side shows were a popular part of the fair, and people were attracted to that sort of thing. My dad remembers so clearly the tent at the Brashear County Fair, and there was a big sign outside. And the sign said, "Come in and see the horse with its tail where its head ought to be." Oh my gosh, who wouldn't want to see that? A horse with its head where its tail ought to be. 25 cents, I think it was, to see this oddity that nowhere else could you see a horse with its head where its tail ought to be. And you went into this dimly lit tent, and there was a great big old Belgian workhorse backed into its stall. Its head was where its tail ought to be. It was such a scam. It was pitiful. And people leaving were so ashamed that they had been scammed that they didn't tell the people standing in line the whole thing is a fraud. And so the guy made a pile of money with the horse with his head where his tail ought to be. Let's go to the next one, please. And then the sideshows also included people like Jimmy Dimitro, and I happened to have been at the State Fair in 1948, and I saw this tent where he was a professional wrestler, and he would take on all the farm boys and whoever else wanted to come in and try their luck at winning. And sometimes the farm boy won, but not usually, because Dimitro knew all the tricks of being a wrestler. But look at the crowd of people that are waiting to go in to watch some big farm kid not win or win. It was kind of interesting. Next slide, please. Well, who can talk about a fair without talking about fair food? My gosh, a fair is not a fair without special food. And one of the special foods happens to be cotton candy, which is really only spun sugar But look at the smile on this little girl's face. I mean, she's right with it with her big old bunch of cotton candy. Next slide, please. And of course, corn dogs. My goodness, how popular are corn dogs? And you don't go to a grocery store and buy corn dogs. I mean, maybe you can these days, but I haven't seen any. But you go to a fair, and there we've got corn dogs, and kids are smiling and having a grand time. Let's go to the next slide, please. And when you go to the state fair in Milwaukee, you cannot, West Allis really, you cannot avoid the cream puff stand. They sell thousands of cream puffs at the state fair every year. It's one of those iconic foods, along with, and this is not an exaggeration, almost everything you can eat, you can find on a stick at a fair. I mean, it's unbelievable what is possible to roll up and put on a stick. And that's where you find it at a fair. The cream puffs, of course, are an exception. You got to learn how to eat a cream puff, and I'm not so sure I'm one who knows how to do that. Let's go to the next slide, please. A little bit of state fair history, because the state fair has been going on for a few days now. And the very first one, very first state fair, was in 1851 in Janesville, of all places. They hosted the very first state fair. And then it moved around all over the place. I checked it out. The history reports that it was 6 times in Janesville, 11 times in Madison, 18 times in Milwaukee, twice in Fond du Lac, once in Watertown, and then it settled at its present site in West Allis in 1892, and it has been at West Allis ever since. Next slide, please. One of the wonderful things that I had, that I was able to experience as a 4-H member, in 1948, Wisconsin celebrated its centennial. And there was a month-long state fair. I, as 13, 14 years old, I got to spend a week at the state fair in Milwaukee. And I got to meet Maggie McGuire, who was the very first Alice in Dairyland. And the Alice in Dairyland program continues to this day. But Maggie McGuire was the very first one. And they had created a mannequin, a life-size mannequin of Maggie McGuire. And she was Maggie herself was behind this thing and you couldn't see her. And so this mannequin would talk to people. So a little kid would come up and say, "What do you know about cheese?" And then she would say something about cheese. And I just thought it was absolutely amazing that that was the case. The other thing that I found kind of interesting was I saw for the first time ever the television screen, and a Milwaukee television station had this television set, and everything was kind of foggy and snowy, and you could barely make out what was on the screen. And I came home and I said to my dad, I saw this thing called television. And we just gotten electricity in 1947, so I'd grown up mostly without electricity. And I said, this television thing, that's going to be a fad. I can't imagine that's ever going to amount to anything. Little did I know what would happen with television and then the internet and all the rest. But the state fair was just an amazing, amazing experience for this little farm kid who had really hardly been out of Waushara County. And now I'm in Milwaukee and I'm seeing races. I'm seeing a Midway like I'd never seen before. I saw auto races, and it was amazing. And I've never forgotten it. I want to say in winding up, and I want to leave room for lots of questions. People ask me, and this is a good question, why have a fair today? Why have a county fair when we have so few people farming? It's true. The number of farmers in this country and in this state of Wisconsin has been in steady decline ever since the end of World War II. And so why bother to have a fair? But let me say this. Sometimes we forget, people living in urban areas, that it's from the farms, it's from agriculture that we get our food, at least the majority of it. And we probably have today the most division between rural and urban areas that we've ever had. There's misunderstanding, there's disinformation, and I see the county fair and the state fairs as one way of bringing urban and rural people back together. We depend on each other, folks. There's no such thing as a rural life and an urban life separated from each other. In the early days, and I read about the history of rural villages, they were very much dependent on the farmers because their markets were in the rural areas. Well, that has changed. But the interdependence of rural and urban America continues. And it must be reinvented in some ways. And the fair is one way, one subtle way, I must add, of saying to the urban cousins, hey, look, this is what agriculture is about. This is what agriculture has been as well. And as a historian, I think it's very important, extremely important, that we know the roots of something like agriculture. And I write about that in my books. But I also believe that we need to pay attention to the present, and we need to pay attention to the future. And the future means an interdependence of rural and urban America. And the fairs are one way of doing that, a wonderful, interesting, entertaining, as well as educational way of bringing back together in a way that we used to know when I was a kid, we were tightly together, bringing us back together as we once were. So that's one of the reasons I wrote this book about fairs, because they are so much more than a Ferris wheel, a corn dog, and a horse race. They are that, but they are so much more. Thank you all so very much for listening to me talk about fairs. As you can tell, I organized fairs as a county extension agent in Green Lake County and in Brown County. I've been a fair judge for many years. And my most vivid memories, as I pointed out earlier, were those years when I was a 4-H member. And I was leading my calf in a circle and keeping one eye on the judge and one eye on my calf and hoping that maybe my calf would end up with a blue ribbon. Thank you all so very much. If you have some questions, I would be more than happy to try and answer them.
Whoops, here we go. All right, Jerry, there are a few questions and comments. There's a couple people at the very beginning. Jim says, I love Jerry's books, saw him several times at book festivals. We have an Emma, thank you for hosting this. You're welcome. And Jerry Apps is one of my favorite authors and can't wait to read this new book. Deborah says, I'll never forget the fear of going into showmanship when I was 14 in 1988 in Clark County. She did dairy showing. And then we do have some questions here. What is your favorite fair food?
That's a very good question. But to back up, one of the things I enjoyed walking down the Midway was the smell of onions frying. And so a hamburger with some onions on it, I sort of like that. And I would always go to the 4-H tent or the 4-H building because almost every fair had such a place. It was run by 4-H members. And so I never had such a thing at home. We didn't do any grilling or anything like that at home. But a hamburger with some onions on it, my goodness, that was probably 25 cents was what it would cost me. And I had maybe 50 cents to spend on lunch. So that would be my quick answer.
All right. Let's see. Have you ever been part of the presentation of the Century Farm ceremonies?
I have not. I know about it, but I have not been a part of that
Okay.
ceremony.
And another one, what is your favorite Wisconsin County Fair? If you had to say pick one.
Well, that's I have a very strong bias because my favorite county fair happens to be the Waushara County Fair because that's the one I know best. I first attended the Waushara County Fair in 1938 with my dad. I was just a little kid, and he wanted me to go to the fair with him and see the cattle judging. And here I'm standing at the fence holding a Hershey candy bar that was melting in my hand because he bought me a candy bar for 5 cents. And I have some strong feelings and all kinds of memories from that fair. So I've been at a lot of fairs along the way, but Waushara County has to be my favorite.
Since we're split, St. Croix and Pierce County, but have you been to the Pierce County Fair ever?
I have not.
Okay, that is starting up right now, and so some people ask that. Let's see. I do have a question. Well, not a question, but in the intro to your book, which, by the way, if you haven't commented or asked any questions yet, you can be entered into a raffle for this tonight. So ask away in the comment section on the bottom right. Tell us how, in the intro, how your dad got his cows to the fair.
You know, that's an interesting story because it's nothing compared to what would happen today. We had probably, I don't know, 12, 15 cows at that time, milked them by hand, of course. And my dad drove these cattle down the dusty road 8 miles from our farm west of Wild Rose to Wautoma, where the fairgrounds was. And he drove them, behind them, he was on he had his team of horses and a load of hay. And that load of loose hay is what he would feed the cattle during the week. And that's how he got to the fair. And I asked him one time, what did you think about doing that, Pa? He said, I never had so much fun in my life. That was one of the best things. I said, where did you sleep? Huh, I slept on top of the hay. Best place in the world. He just loves county fairs.
Mm-hmm. And I think you also packed your own food because you couldn't afford, or a lot of people bought things at the fair, but you brought your own lunches and things. Is that right?
Well, that's true, because you see, in the 30s, we're still in the midst of the Depression, and this is true of almost everyone. And we had pretty close to nothing, and money was scarce, so we would usually bring our own something to eat. By the way, when I was a kid in 4-H, we stayed at the fair. We bought a used World War II tent, and we stayed in this tent. And I tell you, I've never had so much fun in my life. And I think we paid $20 for the tent, and I bought a military cot, which I still have to this day, for $5. And it was wonderful.
We had another comment when you talked about education and agriculture. Some kids never see animals or plants, and the fair gives them that chance, especially urban kids.
And the fair is one way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I what delights me is when I see a little kid, 4, 5, 6 years old, petting a lamb, or petting a rabbit, or petting a calf. That kid will never forget that.
Mhm.
And how better to help educate a youngster than to have that youngster participate directly in, and I don't mean this, have this sound corny, in a hands-on experience. it's it's the best. And you see the expression on the kid's face he's petting a little calf or a little lamb, and it's wonderful. So anyway,
Um,
that connection is important.
yes. Another question is, do you have a new book in the works? And we talked about this a little bit before we went live. You want to
Yeah,
tell us
I have
what
a,
you're
I
coming
have
up
a,
with?
I have a couple of books in the works. Um, the one that's coming out this fall is called it's titled "More Than Words," and it's a story, it's a memoir of my years of writing. And I started writing professionally in 1966. And by that I mean I was paid something for my work. And I began by writing weekly columns for several newspapers. I still write a weekly column for a newspaper, but my payment in 1966 was $5 a column, which had to have a photograph with it. That's how it all started. My first book came out in 1970. And I should back up a little bit if you got time for me to do this and talk about how it all began, because I'm a product of a one-room country school. And believe it or not, we had really good language English teachers. I learned how to diagram sentences when I was in fifth grade, I don't know, sixth grade, and knew what a subject was and what a predicate was and all that kind of stuff. So that's in spelling. The basics of writing came out of the one-room school. But what really came together was in 1947 when I was in eighth grade and I had polio. And my right leg was paralyzed. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't walk. I couldn't stand up for 3, 4 months. And when I came back, I was going into high school. I couldn't play sports. I felt worthless. And one of my teachers said to me, "Jerry, maybe you should take typewriting." And I said, "Typewriting? For heaven's sakes, typewriting is for girls." And it was in those days because young women knowing how to type could work in various offices and that sort of thing. Manual typewriters, L.C. Smith manual typewriter, you really had to work at it. I came to love typing because I was milking cows by hand. I had very strong fingers, and I could smoke the girls in the tests, which surprised me no end because my fingers were strong. The newspaper office was the same as the typing class. And so now I'm a reporter for the Rosebud. That was the name of our high school newspaper, Wild Rose. And by the time I'm a junior, I'm assistant editor, and I'm editor, and when I'm a senior, and I'm writing all the editorials, and I'm just having a ball. And at the same time, that same teacher said to me, "Jerry," he was the coach too. There were only 100 kids in the whole high school. He was the coach, basketball coach. He said, "Jerry, we need somebody to announce the basketball games." I don't think he really did. But here I am, 14 years old. I have a microphone, and I'm announcing the basketball games as well as writing editorials for the Rosebud. That's how it all got started. I've had a microphone in front of me ever since, one way or the other.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wanted to point out, you say you have an article in the Wisconsin State Farmer every week. And I wanted to mention Colleen Kotke wrote a wonderful article about your book that I read out on that website, wisconsinfarmer.com or wisfarmer.com. There were some things that she pointed out, like some of the fairs during the polio outbreaks. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Just as COVID shut down fairs all over the state, polio shut down some fairs as well. And polio, different from COVID, primarily affected young people. Older people occasionally got polio, but it wasn't in the same category as COVID. But we did fairs were shut down, along with all kinds of other events. People didn't know at the time how polio was transmitted, and people were remembering the 1918 virus flu that spread around the world, just like COVID. And they thought that polio was like that. Polio was not transmitted that way. It was transmitted through bad water, through bad sanitation. So it had a different history, but it had an effect. And the Civil War shut down fairs. World War II affected fairs, but fairs survived. They survived because underneath it all, in my belief, was this: we need, is what message I was saying earlier. We need to figure out a way of helping our friends who are not been on the farm understand where their food is coming from, and understand that we're all in this together, and the fair is one way of helping make that connection.
We had a comment. Deb says, "I love how exhibits have come to include Legos, llamas, and even birds now," which is interesting. Another thing that Colleen wrote, during those lean times, some fairs created interesting prize, or they had entries, and the prizes for prizes, including best patched garment or best darning on a sock, which I think is interesting.
That's a reflection of the Depression years.
Yeah.
And my dad would say it this way: we learned how to make do, which meant we learned how to make it with what we had.
Right.
And if we had little, well, so what? We're going to try to make it with what we have. And my dad's favorite saying: do the best you can with what you've got. Never forgotten that. Especially as I get older. Do the best you can with what you've got.
Right. Did you want to talk a little bit more about your Old Farm Country cookbook documentary you mentioned?
Yeah, let me mention that. Many people have seen my book, Old Farm Country Cookbook. I did that with my daughter, Susan. It's a book based on my mother's Depression years, cooking on a wood stove with no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no anything. And we found her recipe box when she passed. And then this documentary, as well as the book, are based on the recipes in that recipe box. And my mother was one who would list the ingredients in the recipe, but she never told us how to do it. There were no directions. And and people might say to my mother, "Well, how do you do this?" "Oh, everybody knows how to do that. You just got to tell them what it is." And for example, our old wood stove, there was no thermometer to tell you how warm was the oven. And people say, "Oh, how would you know when the oven was ready to bake bread?" "Well, for heaven's sakes, every woman knows how to do that. You open the door and put your hand in." I mean, how many people today would open the door and put their hand in and say, "Oh, that feels about right"? So the book has been out for a little bit of a while. And in December, PBS Wisconsin will be sharing an hour-long documentary based on that book. It goes way beyond recipes because my daughter translated the recipes into today's language, but I told stories of chivalries. Most people don't know what the heck that is. Stories of flashing bees, stories of wood sawing bees, etc. The places and all of the Christmas to Thanksgiving and all that stuff. How stories bring people together is another theme in all of my writing, and this documentary is stories of what life was like during the Depression and World War II, related to food. Food is the focus. Stories are the medium.
So what is your writing schedule like?
For 40 years, more than that, I get up in the morning and I walk for half a mile or so and I sit down and I write. after breakfast.
Mhm.
And I'm still doing that. I'm not as young as I used to be, nor is anyone else, I might add. And I try to write until noon. I'm still doing that. I'm 88 years old now, and people say, "Well, when are you going to slow down?" And I said, "Well, my mind thinks I'm 35 years old, so it's not ready to slow down. The rest of me knows it, but my mind doesn't." So
Right.
as long as my mind works and my fingers work, and interestingly enough, for those, and this sounds weird, but for those who suffer from arthritis in their fingers, and that's a lot of people, not in mine, because they're working all the time,
Mhm.
which is kind of that's one of the gifts, I guess, of doing the writing. The other gift, which is hard to recognize today, the reason I'm writing is polio. The reason I'm writing is polio. Once you have polio, you always have polio. It stays with you. You go through life, and I wrote a memoir about that called Limping Through Life book. Once you've had polio, you feel worthless. And in many ways, you go through life feeling worthless. And what does that mean? It means you're constantly trying to prove to people that maybe are just a little bit not worthless. And my wife gets so disgusted with me when I say that, but it's true. That haunts me. It has forever. When I couldn't play basketball, I couldn't play baseball, I couldn't run track, couldn't hardly walk. So I was doing other things to prove that, yes, I may be somewhat, I might be doing something that's useful. I have spoken to many polio survivor groups, and there are several things that I would say about that. One is I saw a lot of wheelchairs, I saw a lot of walkers, I saw a lot of people like I were hobbling along with a cane. But I also saw doctors and lawyers and all kinds of professional people and successful farmers on the one hand. And on the other hand, and they usually weren't in the audience, were drug addicts, alcoholics, and people who never were able to deal with this feeling of worthlessness.
Mhm.
Polio is a terrible disease. COVID may end up like that as well. We don't know yet what the after effects are. Writing for me, and this sounds weird perhaps, is it's fun. It People seem to resonate with some of the stuff I'm writing about. I've been a teacher forever. I was 30 years a professor at UW. So it's a way of teaching. But again, to me, rather than preaching, I'm trying to teach more subtly, trying to teach through stories. And stories are a way of touching people in places that they haven't been touched. And it triggers a memory often that results in that person feeling better about himself or herself. I taught creative writing for 42 years. You probably didn't know that. At places all over Wisconsin. And I'll never forget, I taught the Rhinelander School of Arts in the summer for 32 years. And I had a woman in my class who was from, I don't know, Park Falls, someplace up north. And she had grown up during the Depression. She said, my kids insisted that I take your class and write about some of my experiences. And she said, I was just a poor farm woman. I don't have anything important to write about. I said, oh, I'm not so sure about that. And I got her writing, and I got her smiling, and I got her feeling better about herself. And when she left, she had a big smile on her face, and she had a whole pile of stories to share with her kids. The other group that I've had in my classes that have been really a challenge are the veterans, especially the combat veterans. They don't want to talk about combat, World War II, Korea. But once you get them talking, and once you get them writing about their stories, the wife of one of the combat veterans said to me, you've changed my husband. I said, what? He's a different person. He's smiling now. He seems happy with himself. There's great power in this story. And so that's what I try to do in this fair book, in the memoir on my writing years, in the 6 television shows I've done. There's stories. And stories are subtle. Stories don't hit you over the head, but they grab you by the arm.
That's lovely. I think everybody has a story, and we just have to write them down so our kids and people after us know what we did. Or
Exactly.
yeah, that's
Every life is an important life. Every person has a story to tell, as does every barn, every schoolhouse. And I've written about all those things, sorting out the stories. Every village has a story to tell. And I tell my writing students, you don't know where you're going unless you know where you've been.
That's fantastic. What do you do when you're not writing? What are some of your favorite hobbies besides gardening?
I still run a farm. I have a tree farm in Reserva County, a couple of miles from where I grew up, 120 acres. And I spend as much time as I can up there. That's one of my favorite pastimes. I love the outdoors. That's the farmer in me. I mentioned I walk every morning, and it wakes me up and clears my mind and organizes my day. Uh, I Fishing was a part of me. People will find this strange, but I think last year I celebrated my 75th year of not missing a day of deer hunting. I really, it's just a matter of being out there. I don't, if a big old buck deer stood in front of me, I think I'd wave at it rather than shoot it. Don't tell anybody, don't tell my hunting friends that.
Every time I have an author on here, I always want to ask, who do you read when you have like a comfort read? Who do you
Well,
like?
you're asking, well, there are 2 answers that I would give you. One of the things that I decided when I earned enough money to do it is I wanted to buy the classics, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Aldo Leopold, and I have and Walden, and I have all those books on my shelf, and I reread them all the time. But I read a lot of novels. I still do, and James Patterson. I like his stuff. He's a pretty decent writer. I still go back and read some of Hemingway's stuff every so often. He had a way that I am trying to mimic, and John Steinbeck, of course, is my hero. Grapes of Wrath is the guide for. See, I've written, I don't know what, 10 novels. My novels are Steinbeck is my model. There's an issue that needs to be dealt with, and can I do it in a way that's subtle enough, but still firm enough that people get the idea?
Mm-hmm.
And I tell my writing students, I try to practice this myself. I avoid preaching. People do not like to be preached to, except maybe in church. They they don't want to be preached to in their writing. So how do you avoid that when you've got a perspective and you want people to know it? Well, you create a character who has that perspective. And one of my first books, first novels, The Travels of Increased Joseph, I created a preacher. So if you're going to do preaching, well, for heaven's sake, have a preacher do it. Yeah, that's what I've done with that book.
Have you read Wallace Stegner, Willa Cather?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Yeah.
I read widely. I read a lot of history. I read all the time. Don't tell my television producers this. I watch almost no television. I don't. I read a lot of books, but I watch very little television. I watch the news. I watch some of the specials on PBS. I watch Ken Burns. I like him, and so on.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yep.
I have some names in a basket here of people who have commented. We have about 5 minutes left, so if you want to get into the raffle, you need to ask a question quickly. Let's see, I'm trying to think Are you still teaching creative writing, or is that something?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not. I taught right up until COVID, and then that kiboshed everything for a while. And
Mhm.
if you haven't taught, teaching is hard work. If you do it well, try to do
Mhm.
it well. And well, I'm not teaching creative writing right now.
Okay. I have to ask, since you taught at Madison, I'm assuming you're a Badger
Of course.
fan. That's probably a silly question.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Do you have any plans to do any more Ames County, Iowa books, or no?
Uh, I do. In fact, I have. Let's see. I have a new novel that's probably coming out yet this fall called The Mercantile at Link Lake,
Okay.
and it's going to be published by Hensel House Publishing there in Milwaukee,
Okay.
and it's well, it must be my ninth, 10th novel, 11th, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
So, but I've gotten a lot of hay out of that Ames County series, I must say. Oh, by the way, I have three young adult, young reader novels based on Ames County as well,
Okay.
and they're all from Hensel House, and I'm just now turning in the third one, which will be coming out next year.
That's fantastic. Um, any other questions? Nobody's commenting. So I'm going to draw from this little basket here. I put 5 names in of people who commented or asked questions. So this is going to be our winner. Linda Bailey Mill, if you could email me at riverfallspubliclibrary@gmail.com, we will send your address to us, and we will mail this book out that Chris Caldwell sent to me to give to a lucky winner. So congrats. Any closing comments, Jerry?
No, other than libraries are a part of our future. And if you don't believe that, you are out of it, because I've spoken at 130 different libraries in the last 10 years, and they are, to a library, gems for their communities. We need to support them. We need to appreciate them. We need to spend time inside of them, because libraries have been and continue to be, just like fairs are important. Libraries continue to hold a very important place in our society.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for joining us tonight. We had a lot of likes and hearts, so that's great. If you want to see Jerry in person, you are going to be signing books at the Waushara County Fair, right?
That's one of the few times where I will be in person. 1 to 3 a week from Saturday.
So August 20th, is that right?
1 to 3.
Okay, and you're going to be doing another virtual event August 16th, your hometown library in Wild Rose at Patterson Memorial Library.
That is cool.
So tune in for that. You can always go to jerryapps.com to look at any of other Jerry's activities. You can go to Wisconsin State Farmer and read his weekly articles. He has a blog on Blogspot if you look him up. Thank you, virtual audience, for watching. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you, Chris, for all your emails and help getting things organized for us. My next author event will be Wednesday, August 31st, with William Kent Krieger, who is going to be discussing his latest Cork O'Connor book, Fox Creek. You must register online at riverfallspubliclibrary.org or .com. In our event section, there is an online form, so please do that. It will be virtual. Oh, yes, I knew you would say that. He's a lot of people's favorite author. Chapter Books will be on site selling his book after the talk, so please call us or register online as soon as you can. We have a limit of people for downstairs in our community room. So for more details, go to riverfallspubliclibrary.org and click on Library Events. Your support means a lot. Have a great rest of your evening. And Linda, we'll get that book mailed out to you this week. Have a great evening.